My name is Emily Thompson. I'm 30 years old, a coder who built a small startup in San Francisco from nothing but grit and countless late nights fueled by coffee. That day, I was sitting in a Palo Alto law office, my stomach in knots facing my brother. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his smirk sharp enough to cut glass. "You'll get nothing from Dad's $69 million will," my brother sneered, his voice dripping with confidence. I clenched my fists under the table, his words echoing years of being pushed out of my own family. He thought he'd won, that the company our father built was his. His mother sat beside him, her eyes cold, nodding at his every word. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, flipping through the papers, his face unreadable until a faint smile crossed his lips. That smile sent a chill through me. And then, in a single breath, the entire room fell silent. And my brother froze in place. If you want to know what made the whole room fall silent and left my brother frozen, don't look away. The final clause will leave you just as stunned as I was that day. And before we continue, drop a comment with your guess. I want to see if you can figure it out. I was 5 years old, living in a sunny house in Palo Alto where the air smelled of eucalyptus and ambition. My father, Robert Thompson, was the heart of our world, a brilliant tech founder who could light up a room with his laugh. He'd come home from his startup, tie loose sleeves rolled up, and scoop me into his arms. "You're my little coder," he'd say, setting me on his lap to tap at his keyboard. His company was small, then a scrappy team in a cramped office, but Dad's dreams were big. He'd talk about building something that would change the world, and I believed him. My mother, Margaret Thompson, was his partner in every sense. Mom was a software engineer, her fingers flying over code like it was poetry. She'd hum softly, her glasses slipping down her nose as she worked late into the night. I'd curl up beside her, watching lines of code scroll across her screen, feeling safe in her warmth. She'd smile and say, "Emily, you'll build something amazing one day." I clung to that promise, her voice a melody I thought would last forever. Our house was filled with love. Sunday barbecues in the backyard, Dad flipping burgers, Mom teasing him about his terrible grilling skills. They'd dance in the kitchen, her head on his chest while I giggled from the floor. I'd draw pictures of computers and spaceships, taping them to the fridge, and they'd cheer like I'd won a prize. Those were the days when life felt unbreakable, when I didn't know how fast it could shatter. Mom's work was her passion. She'd designed a piece of code that was the backbone of Dad's company, something they called the Spark. It was their secret weapon, a program that made their software faster, smarter. She'd explain it to me in simple terms, her eyes bright with pride. "It's like a recipe, she'd say. "Mix the right ingredients and you get magic." I didn't understand the details, but I loved how her voice lit up when she talked about it. Then came the day that shattered everything, only days after I turned 5. I was at preschool gluing glitter to a paper heart when Dad's assistant rushed in, her face pale. She whispered to my teacher and I was pulled from class. My backpack still unzipped. Dad was waiting outside, his eyes red, his hands shaking. He didn't scoop me up like usual. Instead, he knelt down and said, "There's been an accident." A lab explosion at his company had taken Mom from me. A faulty piece of equipment, they said later, a spark that ignited chemicals in the testing room. She was gone before the fire trucks arrived. I didn't cry at first, I didn't know how. I just felt hollow, like someone had carved out my chest and left it empty. The weeks after were a blur. I'd sit in Mom's office chair, spinning slowly, staring at her desk where her coffee mug still sat cold and untouched. Dad tried to keep things normal, but his laugh was gone. He'd stare out the window for hours, his face gray, his voice quiet. I'd crawl into his lap, asking when Mom was coming back, and he'd hold me tight, saying nothing. The house felt too big, too silent without her humming or the clack of her keyboard. I'd lie awake at night, clutching her scarf, the one she'd worn every day, hoping I'd dream of her. But even in my dreams, she was slipping away, her face fading like a photo left in the sun. Dad threw himself into work, staying at the office until midnight, leaving me with babysitters who didn't know how to braid my hair the way Mom did. I'd hear him on the phone arguing with engineers, blaming them for the accident. The company grew fueled by Mom's code, but it felt like a betrayal, like her spark was being used to build a world she'd never see. I started school carrying her scarf in my backpack, my only piece of her. I'd tell my teachers I'd be an engineer like Mom, but they'd just smile sadly, like they knew I was chasing a ghost. Dad was there for parent-teacher nights, but he was different, distracted, his eyes always somewhere else. I didn't know it then, but he was drifting away too, leaving me to navigate a world that felt too heavy for a 5-year-old. By the time I turned 6, the house had changed. Dad's smile was rare, replaced by tired lines around his eyes. He'd sit at the dinner table staring at his plate while I picked at my food, missing Mom's stories. I didn't know how to reach him, didn't know how to tell him I was scared. The company was his lifeline, now pulling him further from me. I'd overhear him talking about scaling up, about investors and acquisitions, words that meant nothing to me, but felt like walls between us. I'd draw more pictures, taping them to his office door, hoping he'd notice. Sometimes he did, ruffling my hair, but it wasn't the same. The warmth was gone, and I felt it slipping away just like Mom had. I didn't know then that another change was coming, one that would push me even further from the family I had left. A year after Mom died, my world shifted again. Dad brought home my stepmother, Deborah Wilson. She walked into our Palo Alto house like she owned it, her heels clicking on the hardwood, her smile sharp and practiced. She was younger than Dad, with polished nails and a voice that sounded sweet but felt like a warning. She didn't hug me or ask about my day. Instead, she scanned the living room, her eyes lingering on Mom's old photos, and said, "This place needs a fresh start." I stood in the doorway, clutching my backpack, my throat tightening. Dad didn't notice. He was too busy helping her carry in boxes, his face softer than it had been in months. Deborah wasted no time. She replaced Mom's curtains with sleek blinds, packed away the family albums, and moved my drawings from the fridge to a drawer. The house that once smelled of Mom's coffee now reeked of Deborah's perfume. I'd catch her watching me, her head tilted like I was a puzzle she didn't want to solve. I was sick, still raw from losing Mom, and Deborah's presence felt like a wall between me and Dad. He'd come home late, exhausted from the company, and she'd greet him with a glass of wine, steering him away from me. "You need to relax, Robert," she'd say, her hand on his arm, guiding him to the couch. I'd try to show him my school projects, coding games I'd made on my little computer, but she'd interrupt, talking about her plans for the house or Dad's next business deal. My voice got smaller. My project stayed unfinished on my desk. Dad still called me M, sometimes ruffling my hair, but his eyes were distant, caught in her orbit. I'd lie awake wondering why he didn't see me anymore, why I was fading in my own home. 2 years later, my brother James was born. Everyone called him Jimmy, and he became Deborah's whole world. She'd cradle him, cooing about his perfect little fingers while I sat at the kitchen table, ignored. Jimmy was a fussy baby, always crying, but Deborah treated him like a prince. She'd snap at me if I made too much noise, saying, "You'll wake your brother." I wasn't his sister in her eyes, just an inconvenience. Dad was smitten with Jimmy too. He'd carry him around the office, showing him off to employees, saying, "This kid's gonna run the company someday." I'd trail behind, hoping for a glance, but Dad's attention was locked on Jimmy. The company was booming now, Mom's code driving its success, but nobody mentioned her name anymore. It was like she'd never existed. As Jimmy grew, so did the distance between me and Dad. Deborah made sure of it. She'd plan family outings, picnics, trips to the park, but I was always an afterthought. "Oh, Emily, you're coming," she'd say, her voice dripping with surprise, like I didn't belong. Jimmy, even as a toddler, picked up her cues. He'd stick out his tongue when I tried to play with him, running to Deborah instead. By the time I was 10, I was eating dinner alone in my room, my door closed, to block out their laughter downstairs. I'd hear Deborah talking to Dad about Jimmy's future, how he'd go to the best schools, how he'd inherit everything. "He's your legacy, Robert." She'd say her words, cutting me out. I'd stare at my computer, teaching myself to code, trying to hold on to Mom's dream for me. School became my escape, but even there I felt out of place. Kids whispered about my family's wealth, but I didn't feel rich. I felt invisible. Deborah enrolled Jimmy in fancy preschools, bragging about his genius to anyone who'd listen while I got hand-me-down laptops and secondhand books. I'd spend hours in the library learning Python, building simple apps, hoping Dad would notice. Once I showed him a game I'd coded, a spaceship dodging asteroids. He smiled faintly and said, "That's nice, Em," before Deborah called him away to discuss Jimmy's new tutor. My chest ached, but I swallowed it, saving my game to a floppy disk labeled Mom. It was my way of keeping her close, of proving I was still her daughter. By the time I was a teenager, Deborah and Jimmy had taken over the house. She'd redecorated my room without asking, swapping my posters for neutral paint, saying it was more mature. Jimmy, now a smug kid with a permanent smirk, would barge in, messing with my computer, laughing when I got mad. "This is my house too," he'd say, echoing Deborah's tone. I'd lock my door, but it didn't matter, they'd already pushed me out. Dad was rarely home, buried in board meetings, his company now a giant in Silicon Valley. When he was around, he'd talk about Jimmy's potential, never mine. Deborah would nod her arm around Jimmy, her eyes daring me to speak up. I didn't. I just coded faster, built more apps, and dreamed of a life where I wasn't the extra kid. I was 13, staring at my screen, when I realized I'd have to build that life myself. After high school, I packed a single suitcase and left Palo Alto behind. The house filled with Deborah's perfume and Jimmy's smug laughter wasn't home anymore. I moved to San Francisco, renting a tiny studio apartment with creaky floors and a view of a brick wall. It was all I could afford, but it was mine. I'd spent years teaching myself to code, sneaking late-night sessions on my old laptop, while Deborah and Jimmy dominated Dad's attention. Now free from their shadow, I felt alive for the first time in years. I'd sit cross-legged on my mattress, surrounded by empty coffee cups, diving into online tutorials. Python, JavaScript, machine learning. I soaked it all up, my fingers racing across the keyboard. Mom's voice echoed in my head. "You'll build something amazing." I wasn't just coding to survive, I was coding to prove her right. San Francisco buzzed with dreamers like me, and I found my place among them. I joined coding meetups in cramped cafes where scruffy programmers swapped ideas over cheap beer. I was shy at first, my voice barely above a whisper, but they didn't care about my last name or my family's wealth. They cared about my code. One night, I showed my app a tool to streamline project management to a group of coders. A guy with a faded hoodie leaned in, squinting at my screen. "This is solid," he said. "You should build it out." My heart raced. For the first time, someone saw me, not the extra kid Deborah had labeled me. I spent months refining the app, skipping meals to save for a better laptop, debugging until my eyes burned. By the time I had a working prototype, I'd scraped together enough freelance gigs to pitch it to small startups. Launching my startup was like jumping off a cliff. I called it Code Zap, a nod to Mom's spark that powered Dad's company. I rented a desk in a co-working space surrounded by other founders who lived on energy drinks and ambition. My app caught on slowly, first with a local design firm, then a tech consultancy. Every download felt like a victory, every user review a spark of hope. But it wasn't easy. I'd pitch to investors who raised eyebrows at my lack of a degree, their smiles polite, but dismissive. "No formal education," they'd ask, glancing at my thrift store blazer. I'd nod my jaw tight and explain how I'd taught myself everything. Some walked away, but others stayed intrigued by my grit. A small venture fund took a chance, giving me just enough to hire a part-time developer and keep the lights on. Late nights were my constant. I'd code until dawn, my studio lit by the glow of my screen, chasing bugs and deadlines. My fridge held leftover takeout. My walls were bare except for a single photo of Mom, her glasses slipping down her nose, smiling at me. I'd touch the frame when I felt like giving up, her words pushing me forward. I wasn't just building a company. I was building a life one where I didn't need Deborah's approval or Jimmy's smirks. My startup grew not fast, but steady. CodeZap hit 1,000 users, then 10,000. I hired a second developer, then a designer. We moved to a slightly bigger office with actual windows. I'd stand by them sometimes watching the city pulse below, feeling like I was finally enough. But Dad was never far from my thoughts. I'd call him now and then, hoping to hear his old laugh, the one from before Mom died. Our talks were short. His voice strained, always rushed. "I'm proud of you, Em," he'd say, but it felt like an afterthought drowned out by board meetings or Deborah's voice in the background. I sent him links to my app, hoping he'd see what I'd built, but he never responded. Once I drove to Palo Alto, standing outside his company's sleek headquarters, all glass and steel. I wanted to walk in, show him my work, but I saw Jimmy through the window, strutting in a suit, already playing the air. My courage faltered, and I drove back, my throat tight with unspoken words. I kept tabs on Dad's company from afar. It was a giant now, Mom's code still its beating heart. I'd read articles about their latest software, recognizing her work in every line. It hurt knowing her legacy fueled their success while I scraped by. But it also drove me. I wanted CodeZap to be my legacy, something I'd built without their name. I joined a women in tech group, finding mentors who taught me how to pitch, negotiate, and stand tall. They saw Mom in me, her focus, her fire. One mentor, a sharp coder named Priya, told me, "You're not just surviving, Emily. You're thriving." Her words stuck, a reminder that I was more than the kid Deborah ignored. As my startup grew, so did my confidence. I spoke at a small tech conference, my voice steady, my slides showcasing CodeZap's growth. The crowd clapped, and for a moment I felt like Mom was watching proud. But the ache for Dad lingered. I'd see his name in tech blogs, the visionary founder, while I was just a footnote in his life. I wanted him to see me, to know I'd made it on my own. But every call went unanswered, every email unopened. I'd lie awake wondering if he even remembered me, or if Deborah and Jimmy had erased me completely. Still, I kept building, kept coding, kept chasing the dream Mom had planted. I wasn't done yet. When Dad fell ill, I got the call while debugging code in my San Francisco office. His assistant's voice was clipped, urgent. He was in a Palo Alto hospital, fading fast. I dropped everything, my pulse quickening, and drove south, the city lights blurring past. I hadn't seen Dad in years, not since my unanswered emails and calls piled up. Now the thought of losing him without a real goodbye felt like a weight crushing my chest. I parked outside the hospital, its sterile glow swallowing the night, and steeled myself. I wasn't just walking into a ward, I was walking back into a family that had pushed me out. But Dad was still my father, and I needed to see him to hold on to whatever was left of us. Inside the hospital smelled of antiseptic and regret. I found Dad's room, but Deborah blocked the doorway. Her arms crossed, her eyes narrowing. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low but sharp. "This is a family matter." I froze, my hands trembling, but pushed past her, my shoulder brushing hers. Dad lay in the bed tube, snaking from his arms, his face pale and sunken. He looked smaller than the man who used to scoop me up, his laugh a distant memory. I whispered, "Dad, it's me," but his eyes stayed closed. Deborah hovered, her presence like a shadow, urging me to leave. "He needs rest, not stress," she snapped, her nails tapping her phone. I bit my lip, refusing to budge, my gaze fixed on Dad's shallow breathing. Jimmy strode in his suit, crisp, his smirk as sharp as ever. "Back to beg for scraps," he said, leaning against the wall, his tone dripping with disdain. "Dad's company is mine now. You're wasting your time." His words stung, but I swallowed the hurt, focusing on Dad. Jimmy was different now. Not just the spoiled kid who'd stolen my toys. He was the CEO, handpicked by Deborah's scheming, strutting like he'd already won. I wanted to snap back, to tell him I'd built my own life, but the hospital room felt too small for that fight. Instead, I sat by Dad, holding his hand, its warmth faint but real. For a moment, it was just us, like before everything changed. A nurse interrupted, saying Dad had asked for me before slipping into a haze. My heart skipped. She handed me a note with a login code for an email account I didn't recognize. "He said it's for you," she whispered, glancing at Deborah, who frowned. I stepped into the hallway, my phone shaking in my hands, and logged in. The email was from Dad, sent weeks ago, its subject line blank. It read, "There's something you need to know about your mother's work. Find Laura Bennett. She'll explain." My breath caught. Mom's work. Her code. I hadn't heard her name spoken in years, and now Dad was pointing me to it. Deborah appeared behind me, her voice icy. "What's that?" she demanded, reaching for my phone. I pulled away, my resolve hardening. She wasn't stopping me this time. I tracked down Laura Bennett, a former colleague of Mom's, through an old company directory. She agreed to meet me at a quiet diner near the hospital. Her face lined but warm, her eyes carrying a spark I recognized from Mom's old photos. "Your mother was brilliant," Laura said, stirring her coffee. "Her code is still the heart of your father's company. He never forgot that." She slid a USB drive across the table, her voice low. "This has an email he sent me encrypted about a plan for you. He wanted you to have her legacy." My fingers closed around the drive, my mind racing. Laura explained how Mom's code, a unique algorithm, had driven the company's success, but Dad had kept a piece of it locked away, meant for me. She didn't ask for anything, just looked at me like she saw Mom in my eyes. Deborah and Jimmy didn't know about the email or Laura. Back at the hospital, they doubled down, their whispers sharp as knives. Jimmy cornered me in the waiting room, his voice a hiss. "Whatever you're digging for, it won't change anything. I'm the heir." Deborah stood behind him, her smile cold, her hand on his shoulder. I clutched the USB drive in my pocket. Laura's words echoing, "Dad had a plan." I didn't know what it meant yet, but it was a lifeline, a thread connecting me to him and Mom. I looked at Jimmy, my voice steady. "We'll see," I said, and walked away, my heart pounding with something new hope. Dad was slipping away, but he'd left me something, and I wasn't letting them take it. A week after Dad's passing, I sat in a Palo Alto law office, the air heavy with anticipation. Jimmy lounged across from me, his suit tailored, his smirk sharp as a blade. He leaned back, arms crossed, radiating confidence. "The company's mine," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Dad knew I was the future. Deborah sat beside him, her posture rigid, her eyes scanning the room like a hawk. I gripped the edge of my chair, my heart surging with a mix of dread and determination. I'd come for answers, not to fight, but Jimmy's taunts made it hard to stay calm. The USB drive from Laura tucked in my pocket felt like a secret weapon. I didn't know what was coming, but I wasn't leaving empty-handed. William Peterson, Dad's lawyer, entered with a stack of papers, his face calm but unreadable. He adjusted his glasses and began, his voice steady. "We're here to read Robert Thompson's last will and testament." Jimmy leaned forward, his grin widening as if the victory was already his. Deborah nodded, her fingers tapping impatiently. William listed smaller bequests, charities, distant cousins. But I barely listened. My focus was on Jimmy, his smugness a reminder of years spent pushing me out. I glanced at Laura, sitting quietly in the corner, her expression soft but alert. She'd promised to stand by me, and I trusted her, though I didn't know why Dad had chosen her to hold his truth. William cleared his throat, flipping to a sealed envelope marked confidential. The room stilled. "Robert established a trust years ago," he said, his tone deliberate. "It concerns the company and its core assets." Jimmy's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing. Deborah leaned forward, her nails digging into her purse. William opened the envelope, revealing a document dated long before Dad's illness. "The trust transfers 90% of the company's shares to Emily Thompson," he read, his voice cutting through the silence. My breath caught, my mind reeling. 90%. The company, Mom's code, Dad's empire was mine. Jimmy's chair scraped back. His face red. "This is a mistake," he shouted, slamming his fist on the table. Deborah gasped, her hand clutching his arm, her composure crumbling. William raised a hand, unmoved. The trust is ironclad, verified by Robert's signature and a third-party notary. He slid a copy across the table, the numbers stark: $69 million in assets tied to Mom's algorithm, now under my control. I stared at the paper, my hands trembling, unable to speak. Jimmy's voice rose sharp and desperate. "I'm the CEO. I built this company." Deborah joined in her words, venomous. "She's nothing, an outsider. Robert wouldn't do this." But William's gaze was steady, his voice firm. Robert's intent was clear. Emily inherits the shares to protect the company's legacy. I felt anchored, like the ground had finally stopped shifting beneath me. Laura stood, her presence quiet but commanding. "There's more," she said, pulling a tablet from her bag. She tapped the screen, opening an email Dad had sent her, encrypted and time-stamped years ago. "Emily," it read, "your mother's code is the soul of this company. You're the only one I trust to carry it forward. Don't let them bury her legacy." My eyes stung. Dad's words, a bridge to Mom, to the life we'd lost. Laura met my gaze, her nod firm. "He sent this to me for safekeeping," she said. "He knew you'd honor Maggie's work." Jimmy's face twisted, his voice a hiss. "You're lying. You're both in on this." But Laura didn't flinch, her calm unshaken. She handed William a decrypted copy, its authenticity verified by a digital signature only Dad could have created. Deborah's face was pale, her hands shaking as she stood. "This is theft," she spat, pointing at me. "You've manipulated this, stolen what's rightfully Jimmy's." I met her gaze, my voice steady for the first time. "It's Mom's legacy, not yours," I said. "Dad knew that." Jimmy lunged forward, his finger in my face. "You'll ruin everything. You're nothing." But William stepped in, his tone final. "The trust is legally binding. Any challenge will fail." Jimmy slumped back, his confidence shattered, his eyes burning with rage. Deborah clutched her purse, her lips a thin line, defeat written in her silence. I looked at Laura, gratitude swelling in my chest. She hadn't asked for anything, no shares, no favors, just stood by me, honoring Dad's wish and Mom's memory. The room felt lighter, like I'd reclaimed something long stolen. I wasn't just the heir to a company, I was the keeper of Mom's spark, the one Dad believed in. Jimmy and Deborah could fight, but they'd lost. The lawyer gathered his papers, signaling the end. I stood, the USB drive still in my pocket, Dad's words echoing in my mind. This wasn't just a victory. It was a promise I'd keep for him, for Mom, for me. Months after the will was read, I stepped into Dad's company headquarters, the glass doors gleaming under the Palo Alto sun. The boardroom was mine now, its long table lined with executives waiting for my lead. I wasn't just Emily, the overlooked daughter. I was the one holding Mom's legacy, her algorithm that powered it all. I dove into the company's systems, my laptop open late into the night, unraveling the code Mom had written decades ago. It was beautiful, elegant, like poetry, in numbers. I saw its potential, not just to keep the company running, but to create something new. I rallied a team of engineers, young and hungry like I'd been, and we built a product, a cloud platform that made Mom's algorithm faster, smarter, accessible to startups like mine once was. We called it Spark Vibe, a tribute to her spark, my promise to her kept. The platform launched to buzz in the tech world, with articles calling it a game changer. I felt whole, like I'd finally stitched together the pieces of my past. Jimmy's reign as CEO didn't last. His flashy presentations and bold promises couldn't hide the numbers. Projects stalled, clients left, his leadership a house of cards. I called a board meeting, my voice steady, as I laid out his failures: missed deadlines, bloated budgets, a culture of fear. The vote was swift. Jimmy was out. He stormed into my office, his face twisted with rage. "You can't do this," he shouted, slamming his hands on my desk. This company was mine. I stood, meeting his glare. "You ran it into the ground," I said. "You're done here." Security escorted him out, his protests echoing down the hall. I didn't feel triumph, just relief. Jimmy wasn't my brother. He was a shadow I'd finally stepped out from. Deborah's fall was quieter, but no less final. She'd poured her wealth into risky ventures betting on startups that crumbled under scrutiny. Word spread fast in Silicon Valley her investments tanked. Her reputation followed. I heard she'd sold the Palo Alto house, the one she'd stripped of Mom's memory to cover debts. She called me once, her voice thin, asking for a loan. "We're family, Emily," she said, the words hollow. I hung up without a reply. She'd never been my family, only a thief of the life I'd once had. Her name faded from the tech scene, a footnote in someone else's story. I didn't look back. Laura was different. She'd stood by me delivering Dad's truth when it mattered most. But as I rebuilt the company, I saw her lingering her calls, too frequent her advice, veering into suggestions about partnerships that felt off. She'd been Mom's friend, Dad's ally, but this was my path now. I met her at a cafe, thanking her for everything, her loyalty, her courage. "I need to do this alone." I told her, my tone firm but kind. She nodded, her eyes sad but understanding, and we parted ways. Cutting her off wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I'd learned to trust myself to guard what Mom and Dad had left me. Standing at the helm of the company, I saw the truth clearly. Jimmy's greed. Deborah's scheming, they'd chased power but lost it all. My strength wasn't in wealth or titles, but in the work I'd done, the code I'd written, the integrity I'd held onto. Mom's algorithm wasn't just lines on a screen, it was her belief in me carried forward in every product we built. I walked through the office, my team buzzing around me, their ideas lighting up the future. Spark Vibe was growing, and so was I. I'd lost a family but found a purpose. Talent and truth had won, not because I'd fought harder, but because I'd stayed true to Mom, to Dad, to myself.